So hello and welcome to this video on marbles from Mutable Instruments. Let's check out what's to come in the video. Now, marbles is a random sampler. Sampler in the sense of sample and hold CV, not a sampler as in an MPC, SP1200 or those audio samplers, although we can do some cool stuff at audio rates, both with internal sources and external sources, but sample as in sample and hold CV. Marbles is split into two sides. We have a T section, which is the timing based section. This creates a clock on T2, which is always a merged version, or at least in the green mode, a merged version of T1 and T2, which is a coin toss, and you can play around with the probability, a little bit like branches from Mutable Instruments. Second mode does some random divisions and multiplications on T1 and T3, but T2 will remain that clock signal. Now, the red mode is very much like grids. This plays a series of linear drum-based patterns following common rhythms you would find on a kick and a snare. So patching T2 to, say, a hi-hat, T1 to a bass drum, and T3 to a snare is a quick way of getting beats. But it's also a nice way of working with common beat-based rhythms for resetting sequencers, hitting sync on an analog LFO, clocking various other events in a modular system. We have a Y output, which is always a smooth, fluctuating output tied to the rate that the unit's running at. You can see faster change and slower change, but it's not stepped, it never hangs, it never holds, it's just a fluctuating random voltage. We then have an X generator with an X1, 2 and 3 output. X2 is clocked from T2, X1 clocked from T1, and X3 clocked from T3, unless we plug in an external clock. And we can also externally clock the T side. We can play around with the spread and probability distribution of these random voltages. We can bias these voltages, which isn't as simple as adding an offset voltage. It actually biases the decision making in the module. So it won't take a pattern and just lower that. It will actually re-bias the kind of brain of the module to bias new lower voltages or higher voltages. Spread and bias are very playable and interactive. The step control will take our outputs from an unquantized stepped voltage through to add in occasional slews and glides to these voltages through linear, slewed, random to wonky, more gliding CV. Beyond 12 o'clock, this will actually quantize these outputs to a chromatic scale, by default then to a major scale, although we can change scales and we will do later in the video. It will then start stripping notes out of that scale, taking a C major and giving us a C major 7 by default if you don't change the scale, going through to C and G, root and fifth and octaves of those notes, and through to octaves. The Deja Vu section works very much like a music theme modular Turing machine. We can enable the looping and locking for either the T side, the X side, one or the other, or both, or neither. With these enabled, Deja Vu at 12 o'clock, these flash to tell us nothing's going to change. We can adjust the length of the looping pattern from 1 to 16 steps. We can start to inject random into the pattern by coming off of 12 o'clock, and we can increase the chances of randomly skipping around within the pattern beyond 12 o'clock. And it's great if you want to lock one set of CV values but have different rhythms trigger them with continuously variable patterns from the T section. We also have a jittery clock, which works with internal and external clocks to add jitter that mimics humanized style functions and swing and shuffle and groove and life within a pattern, right through to more chaotic, kind of ratcheting up and down patterns that slow down and catch up with each other that are more chaotic in nature. We've got 7 outputs, 2 clock-ins, 7 CV inputs. It's super playable. This is a really comprehensive module for random, both gates and CV, both stepped or slewed. So be sure to check out the index and the video description to go through all the different parts of this video, and you can skip around and go straight to what you want. Let's get stuck into some patches. So here we're going to look at the T generator. This produces random gates by first generating a jittery master clock, which is always output on T2. And this is derived from 2 streams of random gates, which are output on T1 and T3. And in this first mode, the green mode, up on the selection here, a coin is tossed at every pulse of T2 to decide whether that pulse is passed to T1 or T3. And the bias controls the fairness of the coin toss. So let's just turn on a hi-hat sound triggered by T2 so you can hear the clock. Super simple. Now the bias controls the weighting of this random coin toss. Now with this all the way to the left, and make sure you're listening stereo, panned left, you will hear the sound triggered. And as I move that bias, we can hear it's not triggered as frequently. Now if I move this to the right and unmute my sound panned right, another noise source, now if I lose the clock and put my 2 noise sources, panned left and right, on T1 and T3 in terms of what's triggering them, you can hear we get the same rhythm split with this coin toss based probability, much like branches from Mutable Instruments, which is a great little module. Now, I've ran noise through VCAs using ADSR envelopes. Listen to that sustain period and watch these traces on the Modax data. They're not all the same gate length. Same for the other side. Now, if you're just triggering drums, this wouldn't matter, but key point for me to point out. Now I have some drums, little effect, super dirty plat sound going through the Baron Semedy from Animal Factory, amplification, which is a distortion. Let's play out with the whole thing and we'll move on to the next mode. So in this orange T mode, T1 and T3 are generated by respectively multiplying and dividing the T2 clock by a random ratio. Now the bias knob, turning fully clockwise or counterclockwise, will reach more extreme ratios of multiplications and divisions. So muting everything, I have a kick. That's just a divide 4 of the T2 clock output. That's there just to give us time. Give us a sense of the rhythm and the tempo. I have a hi-hat, which is the T2 clock, and a divide by 8 for the clap. So that's my backing beat, gives us some perspective of tempo and feel. This is the T1 output, panned left, and the T3 output, panned right. Now with both of those up, this will start to give us different division and multiplication ratios. We can hear more multiplication to T1, going over to the left on the bias, more division on the right, and then the opposite way with a bias over to the right. Now we can get all sorts of little cool skips, ratchets, little bursts and drags against the beat. So let's bring in the other sounds. Now just subtle settings. Gives lots of cool rhythms and interplay. Jitter, of course, brings in that jittery clock. We can lock this with the Deja Vu. Lock in both the random seeded jitter and the rhythm from those divisions and multiplications. We could just use one output. Have just some odd little rhythms as part of the beat, and then CV the bias or turn the knob on bias like a drum fill. Could do the same with the other sound. Now with 7 outputs on marbles, it would be silly not to patch some of them back in on themselves. Let's use the smooth fluctuating at random voltage to influence this bias. Let's take one of the stepped random voltages and influence the clock's jitter. And of course, like most modular things, especially with a jitter, some attenuation of your CV values will work wonders. So in this third and final T mode, the red mode, the triggers alternate between T1 and T3, following the same kind of regularity as kick and snare drum patterns. T2 is still our clock. Now there's those randomly ragging around, interesting noisy little hi-hats in stereo. I'll first explain what they are. This is the T2 clock, triggering plats, which is next to marbles. And I have the 3 stepped random voltages controlling timbre, morph and harmonics. And I'm taking the fluctuating smooth Y output into the pitch of plats. And that's this bended, modulated noise and hi-hat like tone that you're hearing. Muting that for a second, here's the kick and snare, bias in the middle. Pretty simple pattern. And these are often called linear beats in terms of teaching drums, where your bass drum, snare drum and hi-hat don't play on top of each other. So this kick and snare won't hit together. It's flicking between the T1 and the T3 outputs. Let's bring those hi-hats back in. Just turn them down a bit. Now I can also take this Y output, which I've split the smooth fluctuating voltage into bias to get changing kick and snare patterns. Let's lose the hats. Let's bring the hats back. Let's lock a loop. So that's now locked. If we set Deja Vu just off of that 12 position, it's going to let more random information in, both on the X side, which is modulating the hats, and to this bias. Can influence the jitter even when that's locked. And also play around with the loop length. So that's the red mode for the T generator. So this patch, beautiful as it is, if I do say so myself, is purely for our listening pleasure. I feel like I'm announcing some sort of bubble bath radio time relaxation CD or something. This patch is purely there to illustrate this X section. And let's just listen for a minute before we move on to specific videos for each part of this X section. Before we move on, I should say if you're a Patreon supporter, there's an extended version of this and also a patch breakdown going through the mixing, the effects and all the sound sources. But let's get into other videos looking at this X section. So let's take a more in-depth look at this right hand side, the X section. My voice just quickly is Platts. This is going through some delay and reverb because why not? It's not about the sound from Platts. But let's check out the features of this X section. I have the T2 output, the main clock, triggering my sound, and the voltage from X2, which is triggered in terms of its sampling random voltages, is triggered by that T2 clock. And this is what you're hearing. First, we'll look at the step control. And this starts with a 0 to 2 volt output. We can have that go 0 to 5 while it's orange, or -5 to +5 in terms of its output range. We'll stick 0 to 2 for now. And with the steps control, at 12 o'clock it will generate a typical sample and hold style step, completely unquantized. If we turn this counterclockwise, it will start to generate smoother edges and then random linear segments right through to just smooth random curves. So I'm going to pull the trigger and check it out. We're getting some glide on some of the steps. Right through to just random curviness. Starting to turn this to the right, however, will increasingly quantize this to a scale and then progressively strip the scale of its notes until just the root note remains. And I'll put some images on screen. By default, this is a C major scale. So in the mid position, this is unquantized. Around 1 o'clock, this is quantizing the potential outputs to a chromatic scale, which is just all semitones available. Going to about 2 o'clock, this becomes a C major scale. At 3 o'clock, this will just give a C, E, G, B and C, like a C major 7. One for the Stranger Things fans. Going to around 4 o'clock, we've just got root and fifth, a C and a G, and then the octaves of those. And turn it up full, this will just do octaves. We'll stick with that major style sound for now. And I'll get into the scales a little bit later in the video. So we'll first look at the probability distribution, width and shape, which is this spread control. Now turning this counterclockwise from 12, the voltages are increasingly concentrated around the centre of this range. Right down to just actually putting out a constant voltage. You can hear those voltages are moving very far from that central point. And at 12 o'clock, these follow a bell curve. They're more likely to occur near the centre, but they will be able to reach the extremes in terms of potential range of voltages. Moving this to 2 o'clock, it's completely equal probability as to what potential voltage will come out. Past this point, the extreme values become more likely. We're more likely to get the extreme lows or highs, and in this orange mode, that's going to be closer to 0 volts, closer to 5 volts. And that almost sounds like string skipping on guitar, where you've got a low part and a high part, and we're skipping a range of potential values to reach those extremes. Fully clockwise, only the minimum and maximum voltages are possible, which turn X1, X2 and X3 into random gates. And we'll look at another patch of this later. So just to recap, center voltage all the way to the left, that's going to be 2.5 volts when I'm in the 0 to 5 volt range. Increasingly, they're going to spread around that point until we reach a probability distribution that is a bell curve. We're more likely to get center frequencies, but we can reach the extremes. At 2 o'clock, completely equal probability in terms of the range that these voltages may hit. Past that, more likely to hit the extremes and not be a kind of center frequency, and total random gates, just low or high, binary logic on or off at full control. The bias control will skew the distribution towards the low or high voltages. And think of this as a probabilistic equivalent of an offset. It doesn't actually shift the voltage up and down like adding an offset, but biases the decision making in the module to the bottom or top of the voltage range. So where we're talking about center frequency, this bias can set that. And then that's the probability it will move from that. With this wide open, we can still bias the potential decision making. The X1, 2 and 3 are clocked by T1, 2 and 3 unless we clock this externally. We can conceivably influence the steps, and this quantising, we can get to different scales, which I will film a separate part of the video for. We can CV the spread, and we can also CV the bias. And we also have a green, orange and red mode for this X side of the module, like we do the T side for the gates. I'm only using one output here, but just to walk through this quickly. The green mode means all channels will follow the settings on the control panel. They'll follow the same step setting. In the orange mode, X2, the center output will follow the control panel setting, while X1 and 3 will take opposite values. So if steps is turned clockwise, X1 and X3 would be smooth, while X2 is quantized to the root note and its octaves. And And I'll just show you that quickly. So these should now be smooth, which we can hear. In the green mode, they're all sharing the same step control. In the red mode, X1 follows the control panel setting, X3 reacts in the opposite direction, and X2 will always stay in the middle, a stepped, unbiased bell curve. It's just a way of getting 3 different types of voltages from those 3 X outputs. So here, let's take a look at this top Deja Vu section. You can currently hear some drums. This is taking the T2 output, which is always the clock, dividing it by 2 for this hi-hat, dividing it by 4 for the kick, dividing it by 8 for the snare. Those aren't important, they're just kind of setting the pace and tempo. We then have plats coming out into a delay and reverb. Again, the sound's not too important here, so I thought why not get some effects on it. I like the sound of it. I'm going to look at locking both the rhythmic side and the CV generation side and influencing these random loops. Even when they're locked, we can still use the spread to control probability distribution, bias to kind of bias that decision making in the probability of high or low voltages, and still quantize, step, skew, slew these voltages. So let's just get something locked first and foremost. Because there's no external clock, T3 is clocking changes on X3. This is going into the data so you can see the voltages, and that's my volt per octave information. Currently just unquantized, stepped sample and hold style modulation, and I'm triggering the sound with the T3 output that is telling X3 when to change. So drums back in, let's lock both the rhythmic side and the CV generation side. So that's now fully locked. I'm not going to change any settings except the Deja Vu to start with. Now, whenever the module needs to make a random choice, for instance deciding on jitter to apply to the next tick of its clock, or when to generate a new random voltage for one of the X outputs, it queries this Deja Vu section. And the Deja Vu section either recycles previously generated random choices or samples fresh random data from a hardware random source, i.e. noise, I would imagine. From 7 o'clock to 12 o'clock on Deja Vu, this is the probability goes from 0 down at 7 o'clock, the lowest setting, of being completely random up to the value of 1, a completely locked loop at 12 o'clock. So much like a music thing modular Turing machine, anywhere in between this will let some new random information in, from completely random to none at all. Let's try and get this now quite basic loop varying by just setting Deja Vu at say 11 o'clock roughly. Lock that again. Now we have a length control. Great for live performance. Let's get a shorter loop. 4 steps, and again bring that Deja Vu back from 12 to let some new random information in. This will happen for both the T and the X sections as their buttons are on. Now I can have one, none, or both of them on. These are both on, so I quite like this rhythm, but if I unlock this X section, X will just freely move randomly again. But my rhythm is now locked and tied. Let's lock this again. Still got the longer loops. Let's get a new loop completely. Now I'm going to leave the X section locked and unlock the T section. It's incredibly musical, very gestural, and having these quantize steps makes for some great generative melodies. So now these are locked, I can make some changes, such as adding jitter, even though my rhythms and my CV are locked. Just that bit wonkier. I can influence this. So for example, the quantising can start to add these linear slews. I can control the spread of this random data. I can bias the probability of these changes in voltages. You can hear musically that same phrase is kind of biasing its way through the potential values that this is quantizing to. We can still change that probability spread. Just going to keep that same phrasing but actually change the pattern. Bias kind of offsets the musical pattern. Now, so far, Deja Vu has either been completely random all the way to 0, which is kind of 7 o'clock on that clock face knob position, through to 1 a locked loop at 12 o'clock. And at 12 o'clock, that is stuck in the loop. When that's stuck in the loop, we can see that these buttons will flash. So there's your indication you are completely locked. But from 12 o'clock towards 5 o'clock, the full position on the knob, the probability of randomly jumping within the loop goes from 0 to 1. So let's check that out. So it's random, but with the information that was already in there. It's not letting new random in. It's randomly shifting around the values already locked. Let's try this with a different pattern. We could let new random information in going to the left. And now jump around this loop by taking Deja Vu to the right. Still got these 7 outputs to work with. Really cool. I should should also say we have a CV input for the Deja Vu. So with this locked, that's quite a cool loop. Let's patch the Y output into Deja Vu. So the smooth fluctuating random of the Y output is influencing this completely locked position, letting in new random information, and then locking through to randomly shifting around what's locked past 12 o'clock on that knob. So here we're looking at the Y generator, and it's simply just an output. Here I have it going into the Modax data, splitting it out to control the time of a PT delay. That's this chip. I hear him getting ragged around. And I'm also splitting it into the timbre and the morph of plats. But the Y generator by default is a smooth full range, and that full range is -5 to +5 volts random source that is clocked at a 16th of the rate of X2. We can modify those settings by holding one of the buttons and adjusting the rate from a 64th to 1 with the spread bias and steps while that button is being held. The Y output is never affected by the Deja Vu, and the button we would press to do that would be this button up here, stated as M in the manual, which is great, by the way. You should check out the manual when you finish watching this video. This is influenced by the rate, so as you would expect, because it's a divisor of the T2 clock. But smooth, fluctuating random, doesn't step, doesn't hold, just endlessly moves around. And we've got this driven, clipped, distorted, reverberant drone, just so you can hear the output. And the Y output, I would say, is my favourite thing to actually patch back into itself. It's a great source for self-patching. Some more self-patching that we could do is to take, say, the X2 output and patch that into the rate control to adjust this Y output. So in this patch, let's check out creating random gates, because that green mode on the T side that does work like Mutable Instruments branches, coin tossing between T1 and T3 while T2 remains the clock. The orange mode then works in terms of adding random divisors and multipliers to create new rhythms on T1 and T3. And the red mode is like grids, kind of, by Mutable Instruments, in that it weights T1 and T3 towards kick and snare drum rhythms. We don't get kind of true random gates, but we can very easily do that on the X side, which is for CV, by turning the spread, which is the probability distribution up full, we'll only get the highest or lowest values. This will be set by the output range: green 0 to 2 volts, orange 0 to 5 volts, and red -5 to +5 volts. I'm going to stick orange. So I have a hi-hat, which has been triggered by T2, and the rhythm of T2, the clock, is shown on data. This is simply a kind of metronome for us to work against. Now, X2 is coming out into the data, and that's this blue trace. Spread up full, this will only ever be its highest or its lowest value. And notice the length of time it's on and off is changing. This isn't a random trigger, it's a random gate with varying gate length. So by patching noise into a VCA and using this to trigger an ADSR envelope where that sustain period is part of the control, let's check out the random gate controlling some noise. Now, because we get bias for this CV section, we can influence the probability not actually offsetting the voltages, the probability of this being the high or a low voltage, because spread will only let it be its highest or its lowest voltage. Bias all the way down, it's always going to be its lowest voltage, which is off. Bias up, it's always going to be high. Now, when we're not using an external clock, it's important to remember that T1, T2 and T3 clock the respective sampling of this sample and hold style output on X1, X2 and X3. I'm using X1 and X3 to control two other sounds. These are just controlling VCAs, letting the two outputs from plats through. X1 controls the sound panned hard left. X3 controls the sound panned hard right. So let's take a quick listen to those. Now, because I'm in this green mode where we're coin tossing and the bias is all the way to the left, as you've seen earlier in this video, this is outputting all of its rhythm from T1. So X1's firing, X3 isn't. Let's turn this up. Now we can still use that bias. That's going to work across all of those X outputs. Let's bring the noise back in. So although they're all related to this T2 clock, X1 and X3 controlling the stereo Platts oscillator outputs are actually influenced by the different rhythms that we're getting. So if I was to go to the orange mode, we're getting different rhythms triggering these now random gates. Now going to the green mode and patching over so that T1 is always firing, I could just patch that across to the clock input. And now all three X outputs share a common clock and they're going to fire on and off randomly, and I can bias these. Here I have a split of the Y output, which is the yellow trace on data, and I'm going to put that in the bias. And we can see on data the kind of correlation between X2's output, the blue trace, and the Y position, and whether that's weighting towards being its highest value, a gate that is active, or its lowest value, a gate that is off. So that's how we can create 3 random gates with a shared clock, or by clocking from the T section out of this X CV base section. Spread up full means we'll only get the highest or the lowest value set by the output button. Now I've already gone through the step outputs in this video in how that we can take, well, slewed values through to unquantized sample and hold, to chromatic quantization, to major scale by default, then cutting notes out of that major scale, root and fifth, and just octaves. Let's just get a loop. Now we can actually change what that scale is, and by default we get 6 different scales. Now we hold the output select button that controls the range of the output, and if that's blinking slowly, we get a major scale when it's green, minor scale when it's orange, and a pentatonic scale when it's red. If that's blinking much faster, we get a gamelan, pelog scale. Orange, blinking much faster, rather than green, is a rag bhairav. Apologies if I've said this wrong. And a fast blinking red LED is a rag shri. So while that's locked, let's check out some of the different modes. So hold this for 2 seconds. Slow green blink major. Slow orange minor. Just hold that again, it goes back out of the mode itself. Let's go slow red, pentatonic. fast green, that gamelan scale. Let's lock it. Just stop pressing things while it goes out of the mode, and then lock that. Faster orange, the rag birav. And faster red, the rag shri. I'll go back to major. Go minor. And that's how you shift through the preset scales. You can program a scale, which I'm not going to do here, but I'll quickly walk you through it. You connect a CV and gate output from a keyboard or MIDI interface to the spread and clock inputs. Hold the external processing button, which is this one, which will process an external in as opposed to the internal sources. You hold that for 2 seconds. The LEDs above the scale button blink and indicate the active scale. You play a little jam in any scale that you want to program. 50 notes or more is the recommended length. Press this button again when you're done, and the module will actually analyze your little jam and keys and notes that you've played to measure how frequently each note occurs. And the least frequent notes will appear to be first eliminated when the step's turned, because we can eliminate from the scale, remember, and the most frequently played notes will be the last ones to remain when the steps are full. A really clever and intelligent way to work with musical information that you give to the module. It is, as the manual states, also possible at that third step where I said to play a little jam in the scale you want to program, to just play a scale in ascending order instead of a long melody, and in this case the module's not going to know any relative importance for each note, and it will just gradually carve out notes from the scale until you reach that higher step setting where octaves remain. So here we're going to look at using marbles at audio rates, and in this particular patch some kind of strange, well, not that strange for all of its tones, but some more unique and strange tones. So we're going to take the clock speed up to the red mode, the fastest mode, and let's crank this up. I'm going through a filter, so the output of marble, T1 currently, is the green trace up top, and the output of my filter is the blue trace at the bottom. The filter's wide open, so you're near enough hearing exactly what's coming out. This is going to be a square wave out of this gate output. Now because I'm in the green mode, I can coin toss T1 to T2 and start losing some of those gates in this audio stream. Now T2 is always just going to be my clock. Filter this. Square wave through a filter. But because we can lock this, we can get some more irregular patterns in these gates that still get more stable oscillator sounds. That. That's quite cool. The rate input will track 1 volt per octave. Let's patch that in. We've got our sequence playing, straight into the rate. I have an envelope going to my filter, so I'm going to lower the cutoff and bring up the envelope modulation. Now bringing that Deja Vu to the left, as we've seen, will let new random information in. So to add a bit of jitter and instability, let's try that. I'm going to just turn the bias back up a little bit. also use the jitter to add instability. I'm going to take the rate control out, filter cutoff up full, you can hear that jitter. Jitter there over a locked pattern. It's like some really cool wave shaping. Let's patch a moving stepped sequence into jitter. And then my volt per octave back into the rate. That's really cool. I'm going to drop the filter down again, modulate the filter. Another thing we could do with this is take the X side and say modulate jitter. Locking that. And spread and bias is going to influence that modulation of jitter, giving it different tones. There's some really great gnarly pulse wave type tones to be had. We've still got the always square clock from T2, influenced by jitter though, and T3. Which in this coin toss bass mode, the green mode of operation for the T-based side, we could use this as a stereo pair or a little accent that we run through different processing separate to T1. We could also mix T2 in as well. Now we could take the X outputs as audio. Let's kill my modulation. Now because this is random, it's effectively giving us a kind of downsampled noise. But locking this, is going to give us some sort of tone. Way noisier, but again you could blend this and be quite creative with this output. Let's take that noise into my mixer as well, just muting the other channel. So this is X2 you're currently listening to. Let's bring in the other sound from the T side, going through the filter. And my filter modulation back in. So some great sounds to be had by mixing these outputs and running this unit at audio rates. So in this part of the video, we're going to segue nicely into looking at working with external voltages, but the segue being we're going to work audio rates first. Now I've heard this at audio rates as a kind of strange oscillator, well, very standard square wave oscillator with that clock, but also adding in jitter and irregularity into that pulse stream to create new tones, which sounded great. Here, and currently Marbles is entirely muted. I have a sound going into the spread input that when we turn this on, we'll be sampling external voltages instead of the internal sources. So here's my input sound, and that's coming from Platts, a rather unique wave. That's the top green waveform, and here's that sound not going through Marbles at all, just for reference. Now I have this at its highest rate, and I've got a little bit of offset going into that rate as well, just to push it a little bit higher. Here's that sound going through Marbles. Again, the dry sound, and through Marbles. Now the step control is going to work like a filter to one side and a bitrate reducer to the other. Filter because it will be slewing these values until we get to this kind of flappy version. But you can hear this kind of filtering. And as we come to the right hand side, in a lower rate, kind of sample and hold CV style mode with a low rate, we were actually going from unquantized stepped random to chromatically quantized, and then a scale major by default, then removing notes from the scale, just playing root fifths and octaves, and then just octaves. So if you imagine this is the bit depth of the potential audio stream, we go from quite a high range to actually seeing that bit rate reduction on the waveform and hearing those overtones. The sampling rate, or clock rate, is going to be like our downsampling, like a sample rate reducer. It doesn't sound exactly like a bit rate reducer and a sample rate reducer, but that's effectively what's happening. Because of that Deja Vu section though, we can actually sample this wave. So if I set Deja Vu at full, and I just hit X, that's captured a 16 cycle long version of this. I can pull this out. So let's get a sample in there. No more input. Just going to up my clock rate by adding an offset. We still play around with this kind of bit depth and filtering. We can bias that loop. It doesn't do a massive amount for audio. Step has a little bit of control, but again it's minute really for audio. But we can cut down the amount of steps in this loop. Get some unique tones. Now I could add a volt per octave to this rate input. And I've got this kind of strange sampled waveform. Because we're getting filtering and bit depth reduction, let's add an envelope to that, almost like we're using a filter. We're going to add in some harmonics as we go up, and filter some out as we go back down. So we can actually sample in audio rate waves, do some, again, kind of strange bit depth and sample rate reduction, but it's got a really unique sound to it. Sample in those waves, play around with the loop length of the steps in this Deja Vu locked looping pattern, influence that with the step control, which we can modulate, and that volt per octave playing rate control. Let's move on to using external voltages at lower rates. So for this part of the video, we're going to look at using external voltages. Now I have a melody from This Is Not Rocket Science Tuesday coming over into the Mordax data, and it's this green trace up top. And then coming out of the data on this red cable into the spread input with external CV enabled. I'm clocking marbles from Tuesday, so they're running at the same time, and I'm taking the T2 output to trigger plats, and I'm taking the X2 output back into data as the blue trace, and the green cable is then sending that information to plats. Now, let's pull that and put the Tuesday sequence, other than it going through the data to show us its shape, straight in. And we'll trigger that straight from Tuesday as well. So this is Tuesday playing plats, marbles not in play. However, trigger marbles in time. Use the clock out of marbles, T2, to actually trigger plats. Put my melody, which is this cable, this pinkish one, into the data, out of data, into marbles. Coming out of marbles into data again, and then back over into plats. Now we can play around with the clock speed. I'm just going to slow that down a little bit. Now because this will divide and multiply, there's slight differences, but you can see we're near enough getting the same signal out of marbles. Now what's really cool with that is, even with this free running, we can slew the signal completely to this kind of warbly drunk sound, or just occasional little slurs and glides. We can quantize it just to octaves. We can still bias that. What's even cooler than that is, we can use this Deja Vu to lock the external sequence. So now there's nothing coming in. Play around with the loop length. Still play with the bias. Quantize it. A nice little bit of feedback patching is to take that smooth Y output into the bias and let a shorter looping pattern cycle through this kind of pitch shift. Let's take that out. Let's make a shorter loop into bias. So it's great for getting creative with sampling and locking external CVs, playing around with that loop length, biasing these voltages, quantizing or slewing these voltages. It's great. Just make sure you patch in, and the little icon tells you what to do, but the spread input becomes the external CV in, and that turns it on. Now with no input present, let's just take Deja Vu back a little bit and get some other random data into this loop. Let's change that range. It's a great fun tool for capturing CV sources and playing with those as well. So thanks for watching this video on Marbles, the random sampler from Mutable Instruments. Be sure to go back through this video and check out any of the parts with the index in the video description if you want to skip back through and check out any of those sections again. Hit like, comment, subscribe, support me on Patreon if you'd like to support more content like this, publicly free for everyone, and get the bonuses and the exclusive extras that people get on my Patreon page. Cheers.